The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete floor of the underground gym in downtown Chicago. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and determination, mixed with the faint scent of rubber mats that had seen countless battles. This wasn't your typical fitness center with gleaming equipment and motivational posters. This was a place where serious fighters came to push their limits, where weakness was exposed and strength was forged through pain and perseverance. Marcus Thompson stood in the center of the main training area, his muscular frame glistening with perspiration as he finished his third round on the heavy bag. At 28 years old, he was considered one of the most promising mixed martial arts fighters on the amateur circuit. His record of 15 wins and only 2 losses spoke volumes about his dedication and natural talent. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with the build of a Greek statue, Marcus had always been the type of person who commanded attention when he entered a room. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of South Chicago, Marcus had learned early that respect was earned through strength. His father, a construction worker who had spent most of his life breaking his back to provide for his family, had instilled in him the belief that a man's worth was measured by his ability to stand up for himself and protect those he cared about. His mother, a nurse who worked double shifts at the local hospital, had taught him discipline and the importance of never giving up, no matter how difficult the circumstances became. The gym owner, Tony Ricci, was a former professional boxer who had seen his share of tough guys come and go. He had taken Marcus under his wing 3 years earlier when the young man had walked through his doors looking for a place to channel his anger and frustration into something productive. Tony recognized the fire in Marcus's eyes, the same hunger he had seen in champions throughout his 40 years in the fight game. "You're looking good today, champ," Tony called out from behind the front desk, his weathered face breaking into a smile as he watched Marcus work. "That left hook is getting sharper every day. Keep that up, and you'll be ready for the regional championships next month." Marcus nodded, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a towel. The regional championships represented everything he had been working toward. A victory there would open doors to professional contracts and endorsement deals that could change his life forever. He had already caught the attention of several scouts, and his trainer, Jimmy Castellanos, believed he had the potential to compete at the highest levels of the sport. The gym was unusually busy for a Tuesday morning. Several regular members were working out, including Detective Ray Morrison, who came in every day before his shift to maintain his conditioning. There was also Sarah Chen, a physical therapist who used boxing as stress relief from her demanding job at the rehabilitation center. In the corner, 2 college wrestlers were practicing their takedowns on the mats, their grunts of effort echoing off the walls. Marcus had always prided himself on being a gentleman outside the cage, despite his intimidating appearance. His grandmother, who had helped raise him after his parents' divorce, had made sure he understood the importance of treating women with respect and kindness. However, like many young men who had found success through physical dominance, he sometimes struggled with the assumption that he was the toughest person in any room he entered. As he prepared for his next training session, Marcus noticed Tony talking to a woman near the entrance. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She was dressed in plain workout clothes, black leggings and a gray tank top that didn't reveal much about her physique. Her posture was relaxed, almost casual, but there was something about the way she carried herself that caught Marcus's attention. "We've got a new member joining us today," Tony announced to the room. "This is Alex. She's looking to get some training in while she's in town for a few weeks." Alex raised her hand in a brief wave to acknowledge the introduction. Her smile was friendly but reserved, and her eyes seemed to take in every detail of the gym with the methodical precision of someone conducting a security assessment. She moved with an economy of motion that suggested she was comfortable in her own skin, despite being the only woman in a room full of men who made their living through violence. Marcus finished wrapping his hands and approached Tony's desk. "What kind of training is she looking for?" he asked, his tone casual but curious. "I mean, this isn't exactly a cardio kickboxing kind of place." Tony shrugged. "She said she has some experience with martial arts and wants to work on her skills. I figured we could start her off with some basic pad work and see how she handles herself." Jimmy Castellanos, who had been observing the conversation from across the room, walked over to join them. At 55 years old, Jimmy had trained dozens of fighters throughout his career, including 2 who had gone on to become world champions. He had an eye for talent and an even better eye for trouble. "You want me to work with her?" Jimmy asked Tony. "I've got some time before Marcus's session." "Actually," Marcus interjected, "I could show her some basics. Help her get comfortable with the environment." Tony looked at him with raised eyebrows. "You sure about that? Teaching requires patience, and you're not exactly known for taking it easy on people." Marcus laughed. "Come on, Tony. I'm not going to hurt her. Just some light technical work, maybe some pad holding. Besides, it might be good practice for me to work on explaining techniques." The truth was that Marcus felt a protective instinct toward Alex that he couldn't quite explain. There was something vulnerable about her presence in this masculine environment, and he wanted to make sure she felt welcome and safe. He had seen too many women intimidated away from martial arts by overly aggressive training partners, and he didn't want that to happen here. Alex had been quietly observing the conversation from a few feet away, and she approached the group with a slight smile on her face. "I appreciate the offer," she said to Marcus. "I'm definitely interested in working with someone who knows what they're doing." Her voice was calm and confident, with just a hint of an accent that Marcus couldn't quite place. There was an intelligence in her eyes that suggested she was constantly analyzing and processing information. She extended her hand for a handshake, and Marcus was surprised by the firmness of her grip. "So what's your background?" Marcus asked as they walked toward the training mats. "Any particular style you've worked with before?" "A little bit of everything," Alex replied diplomatically. "I've done some wrestling, some striking. Nothing too fancy, but I can hold my own." Marcus nodded approvingly. "That's good. Too many people come in here thinking they know everything from watching movies. Real fighting is about fundamentals and conditioning." They spent the first 30 minutes going through basic techniques. Alex proved to be an attentive student, asking thoughtful questions and demonstrating good body awareness as Marcus showed her proper stance and movement patterns. She seemed genuinely interested in learning, and Marcus found himself enjoying the teaching role more than he had expected. "You're picking this up pretty quickly," he told her as they worked on footwork drills. "Have you been training somewhere else recently?" "Not for a while," Alex answered. "I travel a lot for work, so it's hard to maintain a consistent routine. That's why I was happy to find this place." Marcus was impressed by her coordination and balance. While she clearly wasn't as strong as most of the men in the gym, she moved with a fluidity that suggested significant athletic experience. Her punches were technically sound, and she absorbed instruction quickly without needing multiple repetitions. "Want to try some light sparring?" Marcus suggested after they had worked through several combinations. "Nothing heavy, just moving around and working on timing." Alex hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "Sure, that sounds good." They put on protective headgear and gloves, and Marcus made sure to emphasize that they would be working at a very controlled pace. The last thing he wanted was for Alex to get hurt or discouraged during her first session. What happened next would become a story that people in the gym would talk about for years to come, though the details would grow more elaborate with each telling. As they began to circle each other on the mat, Marcus felt confident and relaxed. He had sparred with hundreds of partners over the years, and he knew how to adjust his intensity to match his opponent's skill level. Alex moved cautiously at first, keeping her distance and throwing occasional jabs that Marcus easily avoided or deflected. She seemed to be feeling out his timing and movement patterns, which Marcus interpreted as the natural nervousness of someone who was out of her comfort zone. "Don't be afraid to commit to your punches," he encouraged her. "I'm not going to counter hard. This is just about getting comfortable." That was when Alex decided to test herself. Without warning, she stepped forward and threw a combination that caught Marcus completely off guard. Her left jab was followed immediately by a right cross that grazed his chin, and, before he could react, she had moved back out of range. Marcus blinked in surprise. The combination had been fast and technically excellent, far better than anything she had shown during their technical work. "Nice," he said with genuine admiration. "Where did that come from?" "Just felt the opening," Alex replied with a modest smile. Intrigued by this display of skill, Marcus decided to increase his own intensity slightly. He began to press forward more aggressively, throwing combinations of his own and looking for opportunities to demonstrate his superior size and strength. This was where his natural competitive instincts began to override his intention to keep things light and educational. The other gym members had begun to take notice of their sparring session. Tony looked up from his paperwork, and Jimmy stopped what he was doing to watch more closely. Detective Morrison paused in his own workout to observe, his trained eye recognizing that something interesting was developing. Marcus threw a series of punches that forced Alex to move backward toward the edge of the mat. He was being careful not to land anything with significant power, but he was clearly trying to establish his dominance in the exchange. This was familiar territory for him, the moment when a sparring partner realized they were outmatched and began to defer to his superior skill. But Alex didn't seem intimidated. Instead, she began to change her approach in subtle ways that Marcus didn't immediately recognize. Her movement became more economical, and she started to slip his punches by smaller margins, expending less energy while staying just out of range of his attacks. "You're getting better at this," Marcus said during a brief pause. "But let me show you what happens when someone really turns up the pressure." What Marcus didn't realize was that Alex had been deliberately fighting at about 20% of her actual capability. She had been using the sparring session to assess his skills, timing, and tendencies while giving him the impression that he was in complete control of the situation. The gym had grown quieter as more people stopped their own workouts to watch. There was something compelling about the dynamic between the large, confident male fighter and the smaller, seemingly outmatched woman that drew everyone's attention. Marcus began to throw harder, though still well within his definition of controlled sparring. His punches carried more snap, and he started to incorporate some of his favorite combinations that had served him well in competition. He was confident that Alex would recognize her limitations and begin to back down. Instead, something unexpected happened. Alex began to find her range more consistently, and her counters started landing with increasing frequency. Marcus found himself having to work harder to avoid her attacks, and he realized with surprise that she was actually making him look ordinary. The moment that everything changed came when Marcus decided to demonstrate a technique he had been perfecting with Jimmy. It was a feint followed by a powerful overhand right that had knocked out 3 of his last 5 opponents. He threw it with about 60% power, which was still enough to hurt someone who didn't see it coming. Alex not only saw it coming, but she stepped inside the punch and countered with a short uppercut that caught Marcus flush on the chin. The impact wasn't devastating, but it was clean and perfectly timed, and it sent a shockwave through Marcus's system that had nothing to do with physical damage. For just a moment, the gym fell completely silent. Marcus stood there, his mouth slightly open, trying to process what had just happened. Alex had not only avoided his best punch, but she had countered it with a technique that demonstrated a level of skill far beyond anything she had shown before. "Lucky shot," Marcus said, though his voice carried less confidence than his words suggested. Alex didn't respond verbally, but Marcus could see something different in her eyes. The deferential student had disappeared, replaced by someone who looked like she belonged exactly where she was. The atmosphere in the gym had shifted dramatically in the span of just a few seconds. What had started as a casual training session between an experienced fighter and a newcomer had suddenly become something much more serious. Marcus could feel the eyes of everyone in the room focused on their mat, and his pride demanded that he reassert his dominance in this situation. "All right," Marcus said, adjusting his gloves and bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet. "I think we both know this isn't really light sparring anymore." Alex remained calm, her stance relaxed but ready. "I'm okay with whatever pace you want to set," she replied evenly. "But maybe we should establish some ground rules if we're going to get more serious." Marcus waved off her suggestion with a dismissive gesture. "Rules are simple. We go until one of us says stop." His competitive instincts were now fully engaged, and the idea that this woman might actually pose a challenge to him was both intriguing and irritating. Jimmy Castellanos had moved closer to the mat, his experienced eye recognizing that the dynamic had fundamentally changed. He had seen this scenario play out before, a skilled fighter letting their ego override their judgment when faced with an unexpected challenge. Usually, it ended with someone getting hurt unnecessarily. "Marcus," Jimmy called out, "maybe you want to dial it back a bit. This is supposed to be a training session, not a grudge match." But Marcus was already committed to proving his point. He had spent years building his reputation in this gym, and he wasn't about to let some newcomer make him look foolish in front of people who respected him. His next combination came with significantly more intensity, a series of hooks and crosses designed to overwhelm Alex's defenses through sheer aggression. What happened next defied everything Marcus thought he knew about fighting and physics. Alex didn't just dodge his attacks, she seemed to flow around them like water moving around stones. Her footwork was suddenly precise and economical, positioning her exactly where she needed to be to avoid damage while setting up her own counterattacks. Her first real response was a leg kick that caught Marcus on the outside of his thigh with a sharp, stinging impact. The technique was perfectly executed, striking at exactly the right angle to disrupt his balance without telegraphing the attack. Marcus stumbled slightly, more from surprise than damage, but the message was clear: Alex knew how to fight, and she had been holding back significantly during their earlier exchanges. "What the hell?" Marcus muttered, shaking out his leg and reassessing his opponent. The woman standing across from him looked the same, but everything about her presence had changed. Her posture was different, more centered and grounded, and her eyes held a focus that hadn't been there moments before. Detective Morrison, who had been watching from across the room, moved closer to get a better view. His police training had taught him to read people and situations quickly, and something about Alex's transformation had triggered his professional instincts. The way she moved now suggested military or law enforcement background, possibly both. Marcus decided to abandon any pretense of holding back. If Alex wanted a real fight, he would give her one. He launched himself forward with an explosive combination that had overwhelmed countless opponents in the past. His left hook carried enough power to drop most people, and it was followed immediately by a right cross aimed at Alex's temple. Neither punch landed cleanly. Alex ducked under the hook and slipped the cross by millimeters, her movements so smooth it looked choreographed. As Marcus's momentum carried him forward, she stepped to his outside and landed a sharp elbow to his ribs that made him grunt and stumble backward. The sound of that elbow connecting echoed through the suddenly quiet gym like a gunshot. Marcus felt the air rush out of his lungs, and, for the first time in years, he experienced the disorienting sensation of being completely outclassed by an opponent. "You okay?" Alex asked, though her tone suggested genuine concern rather than mockery. Marcus nodded, though his breathing was labored. The elbow had been placed with surgical precision, striking just below his ribcage in a spot that maximized impact while minimizing the risk of serious injury. It was the kind of technique that came from years of training and practical application, not something learned in weekend self-defense classes. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" he asked, his earlier confidence replaced by curiosity and grudging respect. "Here and there," Alex replied diplomatically. "I've had some good teachers over the years." But Marcus was no longer satisfied with vague answers. The woman standing in front of him possessed skills that rivaled or exceeded his own, despite having given no indication of such ability during their initial training. Someone didn't develop that level of precision and timing without serious dedication and high-quality instruction. Tony Ricci had stopped pretending to work and was now openly watching the sparring session with fascination. In his 4 decades around fighters, he had learned to recognize genuine skill when he saw it, and Alex was displaying techniques that belonged in professional competition, not casual gym sparring. "Come on," Marcus said, his pride demanding one more attempt to establish dominance. "Let's see what else you've got." This time, Alex didn't wait for him to attack first. She initiated the exchange with a series of strikes that showcased the breadth of her training. A jab to his solar plexus was followed by a hammer fist to his collarbone, then a knee strike aimed at his midsection that he barely managed to block with his forearms. The sequence lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it demonstrated technical mastery that Marcus had only seen in elite-level fighters. Each strike flowed naturally into the next, creating angles of attack that were difficult to defend against and impossible to predict. Alex wasn't just throwing individual techniques, she was orchestrating a symphony of violence that Marcus found both beautiful and terrifying. Marcus tried to respond with a takedown attempt, using his size and wrestling background to bring the fight to the ground where he felt he would have an advantage. Alex read the attempt before he could complete it, sprawling perfectly and using his forward momentum to redirect him into the mat with a smooth hip toss that left him flat on his back. The gym erupted in surprised murmurs and exclamations. Several members had pulled out their phones to record what was happening, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Marcus lay on the mat for a moment, staring at the ceiling and trying to process the fact that he had just been effortlessly thrown by someone who weighed at least 40 pounds less than he did. Alex stood over him, offering her hand to help him up. "You all right?" she asked again, her expression showing genuine concern rather than triumph. Marcus accepted her assistance, though his ego was severely bruised. As he got back to his feet, he noticed that Alex wasn't even breathing hard despite the intensity of their exchange. Her heart rate seemed barely elevated, as if throwing around a skilled fighter was just another day at the office for her. "I think that's enough for today," Jimmy Castellanos interjected, stepping onto the mat. "Both of you did good work, but maybe it's time to call it quits before someone gets hurt." But Marcus wasn't ready to concede defeat. The competitive fire that had driven him to success in amateur MMA was now burning white-hot, and the idea of ending the session on his back was unacceptable to him. "One more round," he said to Alex, his jaw set with determination. "Best of 3 falls, submission, or knockout." Alex looked at him with an expression that might have been pity. "Marcus, I don't think that's a good idea." "Why?" Marcus challenged. "Because you got lucky with a couple of good shots?" "I'm just getting warmed up." Around the mat, the other gym members exchanged glances. Most of them knew Marcus well enough to recognize when his pride was driving his decisions, and they could see that he was walking into a situation he didn't fully understand. "Your funeral," Alex said quietly, though she looked reluctant to continue. What Marcus didn't realize was that Alex had been operating under strict rules of engagement throughout their entire encounter. Her military training had taught her to use only the minimum force necessary to control a situation, and she had been carefully calibrating her responses to avoid causing unnecessary damage to someone who was clearly outmatched. But Marcus's continued insistence on escalating the conflict was forcing her to make a choice between backing down and revealing more of her true capabilities. And backing down wasn't really an option for someone who had survived multiple combat deployments in some of the world's most dangerous locations. "All right," she said, moving back to the center of the mat. "But when I tell you it's over, it's over. No arguments." Marcus nodded, though he was already planning his strategy. He would use his size and strength advantages more aggressively, looking for opportunities to pin Alex against the wall or take her down where his grappling experience would give him the upper hand. As they faced each other for what would be their final exchange, several more gym members had gathered around the mat. Word had spread quickly that something unusual was happening, and people were abandoning their own workouts to witness what promised to be a memorable encounter. "Ready?" Alex asked, settling into a stance that Marcus now recognized as significantly more aggressive than anything she had shown before. Marcus nodded, his hands raised in a fighting position. He was determined to end this quickly and decisively, to restore his standing in the gym and prove that his earlier mistakes had been flukes rather than indicators of a fundamental skill gap. The attack he launched was the most aggressive and coordinated sequence he was capable of producing. It combined elements from his boxing, wrestling, and Brazilian jiu-jitsu training in a flow of techniques designed to overwhelm any opponent through sheer volume and intensity. Alex's response was devastating in its simplicity and precision. She stepped forward to meet his attack rather than backing away, and, in a movement too fast for most observers to follow completely, she trapped his lead arm, redirected his momentum, and used a technique that combined elements of judo and military combatives to send him crashing to the mat with enough force to knock the breath from his lungs. But she wasn't finished. Before Marcus could recover, Alex had transitioned to a submission hold that controlled both his arm and his breathing. The position was incredibly uncomfortable and potentially dangerous, demonstrating a level of grappling skill that made Marcus's amateur accomplishments seem insignificant by comparison. "Tap," Alex said quietly, her voice carrying absolute authority. Marcus tried to resist for a few seconds, but the pressure on his arm was increasing steadily, and he could feel his shoulder approaching its limits. With great reluctance, he tapped his free hand against the mat, signaling his submission. Alex released the hold immediately and rolled away, coming to her feet with the same fluid grace she had displayed throughout their encounter. Marcus remained on the mat for several moments, his breathing labored and his pride thoroughly demolished. The gym was completely silent except for the sound of Marcus's heavy breathing. Nobody seemed to know quite how to react to what they had just witnessed. A relatively unknown woman had just systematically dismantled one of their most accomplished fighters, making it look almost effortless in the process. As Marcus finally struggled to his feet, Alex was already removing her gloves and heading toward her gym bag. Her demeanor had returned to the casual, unassuming attitude she had displayed when she first arrived, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The silence in the gym was deafening as Marcus slowly got to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. Around the mat, other gym members stood frozen, their expressions ranging from shock to amazement to barely contained amusement. What they had just witnessed defied everything they thought they knew about fighting, strength, and the natural order of things in their testosterone-filled sanctuary. Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead with shaking hands, his earlier confidence completely shattered. The physical pain from Alex's techniques was already beginning to fade, but the damage to his ego would take much longer to heal. He had been systematically dismantled by someone he had initially viewed as a novice, and the experience was forcing him to confront some uncomfortable truths about his own limitations. "Good session," Alex said casually as she finished packing her gloves into her gym bag. Her tone was friendly and matter-of-fact, as if she had just completed a routine workout rather than completely dominating one of the gym's top fighters. "Thanks for the training." Marcus stared at her, still trying to process what had happened. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, what's your background? Where did you learn to fight like that?" Alex paused in her packing and looked at him with an expression that might have been sympathy. "I told you I had some experience," she said simply. "Maybe I undersold it a bit." Tony Ricci had approached the mat, his weathered face showing a mixture of admiration and curiosity. In his 4 decades around fighters, he had never seen anything quite like what Alex had just demonstrated. Her techniques were precise and efficient in a way that suggested military or law enforcement training, but executed with a fluidity that spoke of years of dedicated practice. "Miss," Tony said respectfully, "I don't suppose you'd be interested in doing some coaching here? We could use someone with your talents." Alex smiled but shook her head. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm only in town temporarily." "Work commitment. What kind of work?" Detective Morrison asked, stepping forward from the crowd that had gathered around the mat. His police instincts were fully engaged now, and he was beginning to piece together clues about Alex's true identity and background. "Government," Alex replied diplomatically, shouldering her gym bag. "Nothing too exciting." But Morrison wasn't satisfied with such a vague answer. He had worked enough cases involving military and intelligence personnel to recognize the signs. Alex's physical capabilities, her calm demeanor under pressure, and her reluctance to discuss her background all pointed towards someone with specialized training and experience. Jimmy Castellanos had been unusually quiet during the entire exchange, his experienced eyes studying Alex with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, he spoke up. "You know," he said slowly, "I trained a kid about 15 years ago who ended up going into special operations. Navy, I think. Kid had some of the same qualities you just showed, that ability to stay calm and turn it on when necessary." Alex's expression didn't change, but Marcus noticed a slight tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there moments before. "What happened to him?" someone in the crowd asked. "Last I heard, he was doing some kind of classified work," Jimmy replied. "The kind of stuff they don't talk about in the newspapers." The implication hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the gym was beginning to understand that they might be in the presence of someone whose day job involved significantly more serious consequences than amateur fighting competitions. Marcus found his voice again. "Are you military?" he asked directly. Alex studied him for a moment before responding. "I serve my country," she said carefully. "In various capacities." It wasn't exactly an answer, but it was enough to confirm what many of them were already suspecting. The woman who had just made Marcus look like an amateur wasn't some weekend warrior or casual martial arts enthusiast. She was a professional whose training and experience existed on a completely different level than anything they were familiar with. "What branch?" Morrison pressed, his cop instincts in full gear. "The kind where they don't put it on business cards," Alex replied with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The conversation was interrupted when Marcus suddenly stepped forward, his face showing a mixture of anger and humiliation. "This is bullshit," he said loudly. "You came in here pretending to be some beginner, let me think I was helping you learn, and all the time you're some kind of, what, special forces operator?" Alex turned to face him fully, and, for the first time since the encounter began, Marcus saw something dangerous flicker in her eyes. "I never pretended to be anything," she said quietly. "I asked for some training. You assumed I was a beginner. You deliberately misled me," Marcus accused, his voice rising. "You made me look like a fool in front of everyone." "No," Alex replied, her tone remaining calm despite Marcus's agitation. "You made yourself look like a fool by assuming that because I'm a woman, I couldn't possibly pose any real challenge to you." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Around the mat, heads nodded in agreement as people began to understand the dynamics that had led to this situation. Marcus's assumptions about gender and fighting ability had blinded him to obvious signs that Alex was operating on a completely different level. "That's not..." Marcus started to protest, but the words died in his throat as he realized how accurate Alex's assessment was. "Let me ask you something," Alex continued, her voice still eerily calm. "When I walked in here, what did you see? A potential training partner? Someone who might have valuable experience to share? Or did you see a helpless woman who needed a big strong man to protect her?" Marcus felt his face burning with embarrassment because he knew she was absolutely right. His offer to train her had been motivated more by a desire to demonstrate his own expertise and, perhaps, impress her than by any genuine assessment of her needs or abilities. "I was trying to be helpful," he said weakly. "Were you?" Alex asked. "Or were you trying to feel good about yourself by playing the role of the experienced fighter teaching the grateful newcomer?" Tony Ricci decided it was time to intervene before the situation escalated further. "All right, I think we've all learned something here today," he said diplomatically. "Maybe we shouldn't." "No," Marcus interrupted, his anger and wounded pride overriding his common sense. "I want to know what gives her the right to come in here and humiliate me like that." Alex studied him for a long moment, and, when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that made everyone in the room straighten up slightly. "The right," she repeated. "You want to know what gives me the right?" She set down her gym bag and turned to face the group that had gathered around them. For the first time since entering the gym, Alex allowed her true personality to show through the casual facade she had been maintaining. "My right comes from 6 years in the United States Navy, including 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent gym. "It comes from completing one of the most challenging training programs in the world and earning the privilege of wearing a trident on my uniform." The revelation hit the room like a bomb. Several people took involuntary steps backward, and Marcus felt the bottom drop out of his stomach as the implications of what she had just said sank in. "My right comes from missions I can't talk about in places you've never heard of, working with teams of people who trust their lives to my training and judgment," Alex continued. "It comes from learning to fight not for trophies or recognition, but because failure means people die." She picked up her gym bag and slung it over her shoulder, preparing to leave. "So when you ask what gives me the right to defend myself against someone who decided to use me as a punching bag to boost his own ego, the answer is simple. I earned it." Detective Morrison was the first to find his voice. "Navy SEALs," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. Alex didn't confirm or deny his statement, but her silence was answer enough. The revelation explained everything: her extraordinary physical capabilities, her tactical awareness, her ability to remain calm under pressure, and her reluctance to discuss her background. Marcus felt like he was going to be sick. Not only had he been thoroughly outclassed in a fight, but he had been defeated by someone whose daily job involved levels of danger and responsibility that made his amateur fighting career seem trivial by comparison. "I didn't know," he said quietly, though the words sounded pathetic even to his own ears. "That's exactly the point," Alex replied. "You didn't know, but you assumed you did. You saw a woman in workout clothes and immediately decided she needed your protection and guidance." Jimmy Castellanos shook his head in amazement. "A Navy SEAL," he muttered. "Jesus Christ, Marcus, do you realize what you just tried to do? That's like challenging a Formula One driver to a street race." The comparison was apt, and everyone in the room understood it immediately. Marcus had essentially picked a fight with someone who represented the pinnacle of military combat training, someone whose profession required capabilities far beyond anything developed in civilian martial arts programs. "Look," Alex said, her tone softening slightly as she prepared to leave. "I didn't come here to embarrass anyone or prove a point. I just wanted a place to work out while I'm in town." She paused at the gym entrance and looked back at Marcus one more time. "But maybe this will teach you something about making assumptions about people based on their appearance. The most dangerous opponents are often the ones you never see coming." With that, she walked out of the gym, leaving behind a room full of people who would be talking about what they had just witnessed for years to come. Marcus stood in the center of the mat, surrounded by people who had watched him get systematically dismantled by someone he had initially dismissed as a beginner. The silence stretched on for nearly a minute before Tony finally spoke. "Well," he said with a nervous laugh, "I guess we all learned something today." Marcus nodded slowly, though he was still processing the full implications of what had happened. His entire understanding of strength, skill, and combat effectiveness had been turned upside down in the span of about 10 minutes. "She wasn't even trying, was she?" he asked Jimmy quietly. His trainer shook his head. "Son, if she had been trying, you'd be in an ambulance right now. What you just experienced was probably about 10% of what she's capable of." The thought was both terrifying and humbling. Marcus had spent years developing his fighting skills, accumulating victories and building confidence in his abilities. In a matter of minutes, Alex had demonstrated that there were levels of capability he hadn't even known existed. The days following the encounter at Tony's gym were some of the most difficult of Marcus's life. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the local fighting community, and, suddenly, he found himself the subject of whispered conversations and barely concealed amusement wherever he went. The story had grown with each telling, and, by the end of the week, some versions had him being knocked unconscious by a woman half his size. Marcus tried to maintain his normal training routine, but everything felt different now. His techniques, which had once seemed sharp and effective, now felt clumsy and inadequate. Every time he worked the heavy bag or practiced combinations with Jimmy, he found himself remembering the effortless precision with which Alex had dismantled his offense and turned his own aggression against him. "You're in your head too much," Jimmy observed during a particularly frustrating training session. "Stop thinking about what happened and focus on what you're doing right now." But Marcus couldn't let it go. The encounter had shattered something fundamental in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. For years, he had defined himself through his physical capabilities and fighting skills. Now, those same attributes felt hollow and meaningless in the face of what he had witnessed. "She barely broke a sweat," Marcus said as he unwrapped his hands after another disappointing workout. "It was like I was fighting a ghost. Everything I did, she saw coming before I even knew I was going to do it." Tony Ricci, who had been listening from behind the front desk, finally decided to weigh in on the situation. "You know what your problem is, Marcus? You're treating this like a defeat instead of an education." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked. "I mean, you got beat by someone who represents the absolute pinnacle of what a human being can achieve through training and dedication," Tony explained. "That's not something to be ashamed of. That's something to learn from." Detective Morrison, who had become a regular part of the post-workout discussions about Alex's demonstration, nodded in agreement. "Tony's right," he said. "I've worked with some special operations guys over the years, and what you experienced is exactly what their training is designed to produce. They're not just learning how to fight, they're learning how to survive and complete missions in situations where failure means death." The conversation was interrupted when the gym door opened and Alex walked in. The entire room fell silent as she approached the front desk, her casual demeanor unchanged from her first visit. She was wearing the same simple workout clothes, and her friendly smile showed no indication that she was aware of the sensation her previous visit had caused. "Hi Tony," she said pleasantly. "I was wondering if I could get another day pass. I've got some time before my flight tomorrow." Tony nodded quickly, clearly pleased to have her back in his establishment. "Of course, absolutely. No charge today, professional courtesy." Marcus felt his stomach tighten as Alex's eyes met his across the room. He wasn't sure what kind of reception he could expect after his behavior during their last encounter, and he found himself genuinely nervous about the possibility of another confrontation. "Marcus," Alex said with a nod of acknowledgement. "How's the training going?" Her tone was friendly and carried no hint of mockery or superiority, which somehow made Marcus feel even worse about his previous assumptions and behavior. "It's going," he replied awkwardly. "Listen, about the other day. I wanted to apologize. I was out of line, and I made some assumptions that were completely wrong." Alex studied him for a moment, and Marcus had the uncomfortable feeling that she was evaluating his sincerity with the same analytical precision she had applied to dismantling his fighting technique. "Apology accepted," she said finally. "Everyone makes assumptions sometimes. The important thing is what we do when we realize we're wrong." Jimmy Castellanos approached the group, his curiosity about Alex's background finally overcoming his natural discretion. "Miss, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how long were you in the teams?" Alex seemed to consider whether to answer the question, then apparently decided there was no harm in providing some basic information. 6 years active duty, she said. 3 deployments overseas, mostly counter-terrorism and direct action missions. "And the hand-to-hand training?" Jimmy pressed. "Where does that level of skill come from?" "Multiple sources," Alex replied. "Basic military combatives, advanced courses in various martial arts, and a lot of practical application in real-world situations." The casual way she mentioned practical application in real-world situations sent a chill through Marcus. He was beginning to understand that Alex's fighting skills had been developed and tested under circumstances where making a mistake could have fatal consequences. "What made you decide to join the Navy?" Detective Morrison asked, his professional curiosity evident. Alex's expression became more serious, and, for a moment, Marcus caught a glimpse of the steel that lay beneath her friendly exterior. "Family tradition," she said simply. "My father was a Marine, killed in action when I was 16. I decided I wanted to continue his service in my own way." The revelation added another layer to Marcus's understanding of the woman he had so carelessly underestimated. Her motivation for pursuing such demanding and dangerous work came from a place of personal loss and dedication that was completely foreign to his own experience. "I'm sorry for your loss," Marcus said quietly, and meant it. "Thank you," Alex replied. "He taught me that true strength comes from protecting others, not from proving how tough you are." The word stung because Marcus recognized the implied criticism of his own motivations for fighting. His involvement in martial arts had always been about personal achievement and recognition rather than any higher purpose. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said, surprising himself with his boldness. "Sure. When we were sparring the other day, at what point did you decide to stop holding back?" Alex considered the question carefully. "Honestly? I was holding back the entire time. What you experienced was me trying to control the situation with minimal force while protecting both of us from injury." Marcus felt his knees go weak. "You mean you could have ended it any time I wanted to," Alex confirmed. "But that wasn't the goal. The goal was to defend myself while teaching you something about assumptions and respect." Tony shook his head in amazement. "Jesus, lady. Marcus is one of our best fighters. If that was you holding back, what would happen if you actually cut loose?" "Nothing good," Alex said matter-of-factly. "Which is why control and judgment are more important than raw capability. Any idiot can hurt someone. It takes real skill to use exactly the amount of force necessary to achieve your objective and no more." Jimmy nodded approvingly. "That's the difference between a fighter and a warrior," he said. "Fighters compete for glory. Warriors fight to protect and serve." "So what happens now?" Marcus asked. "I mean, where do I go from here? How do I train knowing that everything I thought I knew was basically useless?" Alex looked at him with an expression that might have been sympathy. "Your training isn't useless, Marcus. Your techniques are sound, and you have good athletic ability. What you need to work on is your mindset." "What do you mean?" "Right now, you fight to prove something about yourself," Alex explained. You're trying to validate your strength and skill through competition and dominance. That's not necessarily wrong, but it's limiting. She moved closer to the group, and Marcus noticed that several other gym members had gathered around to listen to what she was saying. Real martial arts, the kind that can save your life or protect innocent people, comes from a different place, Alex continued. It comes from understanding that violence should always be the last resort, used only when all other options have been exhausted. But, how do you develop that level of skill without competition? Marcus asked. I mean, you have to test yourself against real opposition. You do test yourself, Alex agreed. But, the test isn't whether you can beat someone else. The test is whether you can protect the people who depend on you when it really matters. Detective Morrison leaned forward. She's talking about the warrior mindset versus the competitor mindset, he said. Cops deal with the same thing. Are you fighting to win, or are you fighting to go home to your family? Alex nodded. Exactly. When your motivation shifts from personal glory to protecting others, everything about your approach changes. Your training becomes more focused, your techniques become more efficient, and your judgment becomes more sound. Marcus was beginning to understand what she meant, but he wasn't sure how to make that kind of fundamental shift in his thinking. How do you make that transition? He asked. By finding something bigger than yourself to fight for, Alex replied. For me, it was honoring my father's memory and protecting my teammates. For you, it might be something completely different. Like what? Alex gestured around the gym. Look around this room. You see competitors and athletes. But I see potential protectors. People who could step up and make a difference if they had the right motivation and training. Tony raised an eyebrows. You talking about some kind of self-defense program? I'm talking about developing people who understand that strength exists to protect weakness, not to exploit it, Alex said. People who can stay calm under pressure and make good decisions when others are panicking. Marcus felt something stirring inside him that he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own ambitions and achievements. Would you be willing to teach us some of what you know? Alex looked around the room at the faces of people who had gathered to listen to their conversation. I leave tomorrow, she said. But maybe I could show you a few things before I go. The next hour was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced in a gym. Alex didn't teach them specific techniques or combinations. Instead, she focused on principles and concepts that transformed their understanding of what martial arts could be. She demonstrated how awareness and positioning could prevent conflicts before they started. She showed them how to read body language and verbal cues to identify potential threats before they materialized. Most importantly, she taught them how to de-escalate situations and use the minimum force necessary to protect themselves and others. Violence should never be your first choice, she emphasized repeatedly. But, when it becomes necessary, it should be swift, decisive, and controlled. As the session continued, Marcus began to see his own training in a completely different light. The techniques he had learned weren't weapons to be used against opponents in competition. They were tools to be employed in the service of something greater than himself. When the session ended, Alex gathered her things and prepared to leave. Remember, she said to the group, the strongest person in the room isn't the one who can hurt the most people. It's the one who can protect the most people. Marcus stepped forward as she headed toward the door. Thank you, he said simply. For everything. Not just the lesson, but for helping me understand something important about myself. Alex smiled, and, for the first time since he had met her, Marcus saw warmth and genuine approval in her expression. You're going to be fine, Marcus. You have good instincts and solid skills. Just remember to use them for the right reasons. As she walked out of the gym for the final time, Marcus realized that his encounter with the Navy SEAL had fundamentally changed him. He would continue training and competing, but his motivations had shifted from personal glory to something more meaningful and lasting. Years later, when Marcus had become an instructor himself and was teaching young fighters about respect, humility, and the responsible use of martial arts, he would still tell the story of the day he learned that true strength comes not from the ability to defeat others, but from the wisdom to know when and why to fight in the first place. The lesson had cost him his pride, but it had given him something far more valuable in return: the understanding that the most dangerous opponents are often the ones you never see coming, and the most important battles are the ones fought not for personal gain, but for the protection of others.